Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for EMCA's Never Forget the Burning of Smyrna and the 30-Year Systemic Hellenic Christian Genocide panel discussion in association with the HEPA's Hellenic Cultural Commission. My name is Lou Katzos. I'm EMCA's president, and I'm also the chairman of HEPA's Hellenic Cultural Commission. Our distinguished panel today includes Professor Isminye Lam, the director of the Modern Greek program in the Department of Classics at Georgetown University, who will speak on the fascinating and critically important historical insights gleaned from George Horton's biography. Genocide scholar Dr. Panayotis Diamadis will speak on true leadership, American and Australian relief efforts for survivors of the genocides. Author-engineer Savas Sam Potsoglu, who will speak on the Greek genocide in American Naval Diaries, and Dr. Peter Stavranidis, professor, educator, community leader in Hellenic genocide issues, will speak on the Megadi Idea, the great idea, an illusionary dream or an attainable vision. This year is the 99th anniversary of the burning of Smyrna, and part of the final chapter that has been described in authors Benny Morris and Dor Zev's book on the 30-year genocide, Turkey's destruction of Christian minorities, 1894 to 1924. Although we have different dates of remembrance for the various aspects of the systemic Christian genocide, in one case Hellenic, Thracian, Pontian, Asia Minor, Armenian, and Assyrian by the Ottoman Turks, it is important to note that the genocide in many ways should be understood as a single event that targeted all Christian minorities in the late Ottoman period. Millions were targeted and systematically murdered during that period, and it is shocking, it is absolutely shocking that some nations have not recognized the first major genocide of the 20th century, right to this day. Although Christians in 1894 represented 20% of the population, and this is not disputed, in what later became the Turkish Republic in 1923, only tens of thousands remained in 1924. We hope this panel discussion and conversation contributes to a continuing wave of research, discussions, activism, justice, and results in terms of recognition on this very important topic of historic systemic genocide. May the memories of those that perished and those subjected to inhuman cruelties be eternal and never forgotten. A little bit of background before we start with our panelists and then the open panel discussion. The burning of Smyrna, or also known as the Smyrna catastrophe in the Hellenic Katastrophitis Smyrnis, refers to the deliberately set fire 4 days after Turkish forces entered and captured the port city of cosmopolitan Smyrna, and which completely destroyed its Hellenic and Armenian quarters. Its Muslim quarters escaped damage. The fire was started in September 13 and extinguished September 22nd in 1922. Turkish troops, per eyewitnesses, systematically cordoned off the quay to contain the Hellenes and Armenians within the fire zone quarters and prevented them from fleeing. The estimated Hellenic and Armenian deaths resulting from the fire range as high as 100,000 souls. Approximately up to 400,000 Hellenic and Armenian refugees who came in from other parts of Asia Minor to escape the Turkish troops and irregulars who were storming towards Smyrna, crammed its waterfronts and quays to escape from the horrific flames. Eyewitness reports describe panic-stricken civilian refugees diving into the water to escape the flames, and that their terrified screaming could be heard many miles away. They were forced to remain under harsh conditions and were periodically robbed for 2 weeks, and after having had massacres and atrocities committed on them before the outbreak of the fire. women were raped, and tens of thousands of Hellenic and Armenian men were subsequently deported into the interior of Anatolia, and many died in harsh and brutal conditions as a result. After the Smyrna catastrophe, the Hellenic city, founded more than 3,000 years before, a jewel of the Eastern Mediterranean, ceased to have Hellenic residents and Armenian residents. It's important to note that, just as a sidebar, during that particular period before the burning, there was approximately 150,000 each of Turks and Hellenes, about 25,000 Armenians, and 25,000 of various other peoples. After the burning of Smyrna, when they took the first census in about 1927, there were 168,000 Turks within Smyrna, and very few other people, about 24,000 other people, but no really Hellenes or Armenians to speak of. So I'd like to start introducing our panelists. Again, they will make presentations as we discussed earlier. And we're going to start with Professor Ismini Lam. Ismini is the director of the Modern Greek Studies program, as we indicated, at Georgetown University, where she teaches all levels of modern Greek language and a wide range of interdisciplinary courses in Hellenic culture, including courses in media, film, Byzantine history, civilization, the Orthodox faith, and Greek business culture. She is also a C.S. Lewis Fellow. Her research includes the influence of political ethos and media on Greek national identity and expression, modern Greek reception studies, national and ecumenical Hellenism, and social and humanitarian issues in contemporary Hellas. Currently, she is writing a biography of the American Philhellene, classicist, author, diplomat, ethnographer, and humanitarian and activist George Horton. Her presentation will be on Horton. It's called "Fascinating and Critically Important Historical Insights Gleaned from George Horton's Biography." Ismini.
Well, thank you very much, Lou. I am honored indeed to be invited by you and AMBSA, as well as the HEPA Hellenic Culture Commission, to speak about the Smyrna catastrophe of 1922. And you have already indicated the title of my presentation. And before I go, I would like to say, for those who do not know of Horton, he was the American consul serving in Smyrna from 1919 to 1922, and he was present when it was sacked and burned by Turkish forces. He was a well-known diplomat with decades of experience in Greece and the Ottoman Empire, and a Near East expert. He later wrote about his experiences in Smyrna in his book, The Blight of Asia. For the past 8 years, I have been researching and writing his biography with the invaluable help of my husband. And I must say, it has been an education. So here are the 4 points I would like to share with you today. World War I ended on the Southeastern Front, not the Western Front. Second point, what is commonly called the Greco-Turkish War was actually a continuation of World War I. Third, the Greek administration of Smyrna, often criticized, was actually progressive. And finally, more than it is commonly known, the world paid a terrible price for whitewashing the Christian genocides in Anatolia. So let's look at these 4 points in a bit more detail. First, World War I, the First World War ended on the Southeastern, not the Western Front, as commonly believed. Everyone was preoccupied with Germany, but George knew the war was won indirectly by knocking its alliance partners, Bulgaria and Turkey, out of the war. Germany indeed never collapsed on the Western Front. Instead, its left wing in the Balkans and Near East fell, making the Central Powers position impossible. George was there when it happened, serving as the American consul in Thessaloniki. The French general Louis-François d'Espery, who incidentally was dating George's sister-in-law, used the influx of new Greek troops, 9 divisions of them, more than 250,000 men, to go on the offensive. Greek and British forces pinned down the best Bulgarian troops north of Thessaloniki, while French colonial, and Serbian forces, very brave Serbian forces, broke through Bulgarian defenses in the Balkans and raced 400 miles north in less than 2 months, forcing first Bulgaria, then the Ottoman Empire, then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and finally Germany to surrender. History books seldom mention D'Espery or how the war really ended, but Horton knew, and it was significant for several reasons. For Horton, it reinforced that first, smaller countries like Greece played a critical role in the victory. They do matter. Greek participation was a close-run thing, only secured when the Venizelos prevailed over the royalists in Greek politics. Further, domestic politics and post-war regime types were critical, and that the Allies had a vested interest in promoting democratic governance in defeated countries like Turkey, even if it required military force. Lastly, the Near East was of great importance for world peace, a point not to be undervalued as we keep seeing through time. Now, for the second point, the so-called Greco-Turkish War is widely misconstrued and misnamed. Horton believed that what is commonly referred to today as the Greco-Turkish War was a continuation of World War I. The Allies wanted to dismantle the Ottoman Empire and ensure governance in Asia Minor that would protect the Christian minorities. Many Turks decided to resist the Allies and did so from the time the armistice was signed. These forces, later dubbed Kemal's nationalists, fought to hold on to as much territory as possible and to expel all the Christians. Now, this was important for several reasons. First, it underscores what the fighting was all about, namely, whether the Turks would be required to respect the terms of the armistice and peace treaty they had signed, and what type of governance would replace Ottoman rule. It also underscores the fact that the fighting was not the result of a Greek invasion, as some allege. Further, it underscores the Allied obligation to Greece. Horton disagreed with the Allied decision to send Greek forces to Smyrna, thinking it would incite more Turkish resistance and that Greece had insufficient resources for the undertaking. It was really going bankrupt. However, having made the mistake of sending Greek forces, Horton argued that Allies needed to rally around their wartime partner and support its peacemaking effort. The Allies did just the opposite. Thus, it was the Allies who were defeated in Turkey in 1922, not just Greece. And worst of all, it came about because of Allied betrayal. Italy, France, and Russia all switched sides and actively supported Kemal, hoping to obtain territorial, political, or commercial benefits. But it proved disastrous for them, as I will argue in a moment. To the third point, the Greek administration of Smyrna was indeed progressive. Contrary to the general view that Greece made a hash of things in Anatolia, Horton insisted the opposite was true. In The Blight of Asia, he argued that, quote, despite many difficulties, the Greek civil authorities, as far as their influence extended, succeeded in giving Smyrna and a large portion of the occupied territory the most orderly, civilized, and progressive administration that has had in historic times. Well, in the interest of time, I won't say more on this. I will just direct your attention to the superb 1984 King's College London dissertation by Victoria Solomonidis, which I hope is published someday. And on to the last point. The world paid a fearful price for not enforcing the peace with Turkey and abandoning, indeed betraying, Greece. Horton watched the Allies betray Greece for 3 years, from 1919 to 1922, beginning with the Italians, who conspired with Turkish leaders to ensure that the landing of Greek troops was met with violence. Horton documented the ambush of the disembarking Greek forces, as well as the refusal of the Allied forces to accompany the Greeks ashore. He actually called this, quote, his words, the first indication of the lack of united support that ultimately caused the Greek disaster and the destruction of Smyrna. And here is something else that is not widely known. Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, admitted Horton was right about the Allied betrayal of Greece. He did so in a remarkable but much ignored speech in Parliament just 1 month before Smyrna was sacked and burned. Horton also fought against the Lausanne Treaty, which rewarded the Turks for the genocide and ethnic cleansing of the Christians with recognition and commercial benefits. Those were their rewards. Worse, the Lausanne Treaty also contained a secret clause that absolved the Turks of all guilt. As Horton feared, the world paid a fearful price for whitewashing the genocide of Christians in Anatolia. Most people know that genocide scholars, starting with Raphael Lemkin, the Holocaust survivor who formulated the concept of genocide, recognized that the failure to punish Turkey's leaders for the genocides, was a dire mistake that encouraged even greater outrages against civilians in World War II. What most people do not know is that recent scholarship reveals the extent to which the Germans wanted to emulate the Turks and their genocide well before the rise of Hitler. Stefan Ehring's 2 recent books on the topic demonstrate how fervently German leaders before Hitler admired the Turks for reversing the Allied victory, for overturning their harsh peace terms, and creating a homogeneous nation by force, and even at the cost of genocide. In fact, the Nazis replicated the Turks' model of genocide. First, they disarmed the Jews. Then they used propaganda to stigmatize them as outsiders who threatened the nation, then rounded them up, robbed them, and confiscated their property, and finally deported them ostensibly to relocate for work, but away from population centers where their true fate would be more easily known. And of course, finally, they mass murdered them, just like the Turks did to the Christians. Some may ask whether this is relevant to the problems we face today. Yes, it is. The issues Horton contended with are still with us today. Even the newspaper headlines are sometimes similar. For example, Horton was disgusted when an American magazine made light of the agonized Christian women in Smyrna who threw their babies to American sailors over a high iron picket fence, separating them from the safety of the ships in port. They wanted their children safe, even though they could not be. Just recently, news reports around the world highlighted the eerily similar agony of Afghani women who threw their babies over razor wire to US and British troops in hopes of saving them from the Taliban. More broadly, Horton's experience is relevant to current affairs. Horton stressed the advantages of diversity and civil liberties instead of forced racial and religious homogeneity, an issue very much with us today. He also examined the causes of terrorism and conflict in the Middle East and why so many adherents of Islam tolerate or support violence against civilians, a vexing issue still very much with us today. And finally, he gives us an example of fearless commitment to truth and the dangers and evils that emerge when people devalue truth. He fought against the whitewashing of genocide, arguing that compromising the truth could not lead to anything good. Without an accurate description of what happens, like he provided in The Blight of Asia, it is impossible to understand why it happens and thus impossible to offer wise prescriptions or what to do next. That perhaps is George Horton's most important legacy, and the point at which I will close my presentation. I am happy to announce that the biography is finished and I am in the process of publishing it. Thus, if any of these issues are of interest to you, I hope you will soon be able to read them, read more about them in George Horton's biography. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Ismenia, thank you so much. And obviously, when the book is ready to come out, we'll have another panel discussion with regards to this particular issue. Your linkage, obviously, not only to the past but to the present is right on. And I would be remiss if we did not mention that last week, on the 6th and 7th of 1955, last week we commemorated the 66th anniversary of the Istanbul pogrom, which were organized mob attacks directed primarily at Constantinople's Hellenic minority at that particular time. We all know that it was falsely triggered by news reports in Turkey, in the Turkish press, that insinuated that the Greek people actually put a bomb in the Turkish consulate in Thessaloniki, and which was formerly the home of Kemal Ataturk, who was the founder, obviously, of modern Turkey. Even though they knew it, they basically created a scenario where they stoked the crowd, if you will, and tens of thousands made up of Turkish mobs were bussed into Istanbul to carry out the attacks. And in the city, they distributed tools of destruction. They distributed actually shovels, pickaxes, crowbars, petrol, etc. And 4,000 taxis were commissioned to bring people in actually for the attacks. Many people, Hellenic people got killed, obviously, including 2 priests and also an Armenian. And due to that, there was the extensive damage during that period and cost of the Hellenic population, including some Armenian and also Judaic and even Muslim communities, included 4,200 homes, over 1,000 businesses, 73 churches, 2 monasteries, 1 synagogue, and 26 Hellenic schools. The estimates at that time in 1955 were as high as $500 million US dollars of destruction, which is billions today. And the Turkish government at that particular time period, paid only 24 million dollars to those who registered their losses. So your point is right on, that these systemic issues really didn't go away. And because they were not addressed, as you state, profoundly, and by the way, what you mentioned today is really fantastic, and we're all awaiting your book, by the way. And to your point, there were 21 Allied warships out of Smyrna when the Turkish troops arrived. And we know that they were basically told to stand down. We know that when they grabbed Metropolitan Chrysostomos in Smyrna, and he was butchered alive, that French troops were right there watching this, and they were instructed by the French not to do anything. So what you say is absolutely correct. And my apologies for going off on a tangent. Our next presenter is Dr. Peter Stavranidis, Peter, a successful entrepreneur, has been active in the Hellenic American community and has held numerous leadership posts with organizations connected with Hellenic issues of the diaspora and the genocide of Asia Minor. A passionate political activist and lobbyist for Hellenic and Pontian issues. He was instrumental in helping unanimously pass the resolution by the state legislature of New Jersey in 2006, urging Turkey to respect the rights and religious freedoms of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. He is the past president of the Pan-Pontian Federation of the US and Canada, and in his tenure, the first state proclamation in 2002, New York and New Jersey, regarding the Asia Minor Pontian genocide took place. He is currently the president of the scientific and cultural organization, the Hellenic Link of New Jersey, and he sits on the board of trustees of the State Theater of New Jersey and the Harvest of Hope. Peter has a passion for education, teaching occasionally, and as an adjunct professor, taught at the Fashion Institute of Technology, and currently conducting research on the history of Greek Jews in conjunction with the Pantheon University of Greece. He is an archon of the Order of St. Andrew, the Apostle, and on the Education Committee of the Metropolis of New Jersey. He will be speaking on the Megali Idea, what is known as the Great Idea, an illusionary dream or an attainable vision. Peter is frozen, so don't think that he doesn't want to move,
No,
but
I'm
we will
not.
be able to hear his
I'm
presentation.
I'm well and alive, Luke. Thank you so much. So, is it an illusionary dream, pseudesthesia, or aphelia, or an attainable vision, εφικτό όραμα ή εφικτό εγχείρημα, just to say a few Greek words there. Now, the Smyrna catastrophe, which was also the end of Hellenism in Asia Minor, has been for many decades a topic quite unpleasant and unresolved. Not only the minds of the pundits of the political, academic, and diplomatic circles, but also in the hearts and souls of the contemporary Hellenes, especially the descendants of the hundreds of thousands of victims that were massacred during that horrific era. And I happen to be one of those descendants, as my roots are from Pontus. So the demise of the millions of the Christian populations that inhabited Anatolia and the coast of Ionia left a big vacuum, a demographic, economic, and geostrategic vacuum, which in the years to follow has been gradually developed into a very densely populated area called the Republic of Turkey, becoming a gruesome and strategic arm of a neighbor that keeps on reminding us with its aggressive actions and intimidating rhetoric that only if you command both coasts of the Aegean, you can claim ownership to the Aegean archipelago. So before we even touch upon the who were the main actors that contributed to the events and the how it happened, I would like to start with the why. Coincidentally, I have four circumstances that contributed to this expedition. One is this ambitious military expedition against Turkey, a little over 100 years from the March 25th revolution, finds Greece in a much different situation. Greece has undergone some major expansion from the skillful diplomatic, military, and strategic alliances against Turkey and Bulgaria during the Balkan Wars. It finds itself on the side of the victors, having more than double its territory. So we also have to note that besides the unfortunate incident of the Greco-Turkish War of 1897, when the Kingdom of Greece lost and was forced into paying tremendous war reparations and ceded small territories in Thessaly, Greece has won every other military engagement vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire. So this is number one. Number two, that the victorious powers of Entente had already decided that disintegration of the sick man of Europe, as the Ottoman Empire was called, from the middle of the 19th century. Number three, Greece found itself at the end of World War I on the side of the winners, and its military forces had not suffered any heavy losses during that period. And number four, the 2 million Greeks that lived in Asia Minor and had undergone a systematic ethnic cleansing or genocide, to use a contemporary term, and Greece had a very strong motive to intervene. Now, the above four statements were the circumstances of the why, but I believe the main ingredient of this ambitious campaign at this particular time, which by all political and military means rendered the golden opportunity, was the irredentist vision to reclaim those lost lands which were still inhabited by a Hellenic Orthodox population. And this vision was called the Megali Idea, or the great idea. But what is exactly the Megali Idea? What does it represent? The Megali Idea is the irredentist vision or concept for the modern Hellenic Republic, or kingdom initially, to expand and acquire the lands that were part of the Byzantine Empire and were still inhabited by Hellenes, by ethnic identity, not necessarily Grecophons, and Orthodox by religion. This Megali Idea vision was nurtured and promoted mostly from outside Hellenic forces, from distinguished individuals of the quote-unquote unredeemed Hellenism, from the Ionian Islands, the epicenter of radicalism and the Megali Idea, rendering some legendary names like Solomos, Calvos, Valauritis, Panas, Hoidas, later from the struggle to regain Macedonia at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. Finally, with the revolutionary spirit of the Cretan people, who wouldn't allow for a moment the members of the nomenclature of this young Hellenic Republic, political, military, and administrative, to rest in the comfort zone of xenocracy, xenocratia, this cancer which unfortunately still exists in this very day with a number of Greek politicians and the nouveau riche of the Athenian upper class. And here comes the Cretan Revolution and her legendary son, Eleftherios Venizelos, whose understanding of the Megali Idea is to unite the tiny Hellenic Republic with the lands and the millions of Hellenes that lived elsewhere. There is only one precondition, and that is that the interior Hellenic political system of that time would embrace this idea, this great idea, and go along with it in letter and in spirit. Under these unique circumstances, it would be politically and militarily a tremendous mistake for Greece to remain idle. The only huge question that historians, political scientists, and sociologists will be called time after time to give an answer is why Venizelos decided, in the midst of the winning theater of military operations of the Asia Minor campaign, to declare elections. After the signing of the Sèvres Treaty, which gave Greece the Commission of Smyrna and the Ionian coast, plus a few other territorial advantages, why? During that time, the British diplomacy, for the first time, was considering a solution even for the Pontian issue, a possible formation of an autonomous or independent republic with the collaboration of the Armenians. We believe that this hasty decision to enter into such dire straits during those crucial moments was the beginning of the decline. Who are Venizelos' opponents? The Royalist Communist Alliance and the new citizens of the kingdom, the ethnic citizens of the new lands. But at one point, Venizelos stated clearly, it is possible for Greece to secure its future once it is in complete domination of the Aegean. So let's take a look for a moment at the different schools of thought that existed in the Athenian politics. On the side of skeptics, we can definitely include Ion Dragoumis, one of the most avid supporters of the Greco-Turkish rapprochement, who believed that this initiative was doomed to fail since it entailed military confrontation and engagement. His particular vision of Megali Ιδέα was the emergence of a Greco-Turkish nation in Asia Minor and not one necessarily under Hellenic domination. However, the most serious of the skeptics was Ioannis Metaxas, who was diametrically opposed to such a campaign, promoting his theory that the military challenges to be met could not be overcome, as such an event would be an act of colonialism, apikioκρατικό. Metaxas undermined Venizelos' vision, and the operation, since the expedition was launched, and immediately sided with the royalists. So we have the elections, and the government of Gounaris takes over, which is under, of course, the edges of the monarchists, and they changed the strategy regarding the front with the Kemal Atatürk forces. The results were dramatic. This new government managed to break away from the coalition of the allies. Ioannis Metaxas, Venizelos' most fierce political opponent, contributed immensely to the defeat of the Anatolian front. The defeat presents itself in the most unveiling and shameful manner through the ultimate telegram of Gounaris, the prime minister, to the High Commissioner of Smyrna, Aristidis Steriadis, after the collapse of the Anatolian front. Through this telegram, Gounaris orders Steriadis not to allow the creation of a migration and refugee problem in the kingdom of Greece. Now, I want you to note that he doesn't mention anything about where the names of the migrants that were to come from other places. So in other words, to abandon the Christians of Ionia, Greeks and Armenians, in the mercy of the Turkish nationalists of Mustafa Kemal Pasha, who, according to Winston Churchill's memoirs, celebrated his triumphant victory with the transmutation of Smyrna into ashes and the horrific massacre of its Christian population. These are the words of Churchill. Conclusion: Greece, even today, is seeking to find accountability for the Asia Minor catastrophe and the share of this accountability among the monarchists, the Venizelos, and the communists. One would think that these are issues that should have been resolved decades ago by contemporary Greece historiography. The question, of course, remains whether the Megali Ιδέα was an illusionary dream or an attainable vision. One could say that it was definitely a dream. Everything, after all, starts with a dream. And an attainable vision had the Greek political parties were and acted, if they had acted in unison, it took advantage of the geopolitical games of their time. Unfortunately, they didn't. Thus, the Hellenic Republic remains a small nation with medium geopolitical value and is dependent on the ephemeral movements of power in the region. Today, with the rapid increase in economy and population, Turkey has been transformed from a nation of Asia to a nation of the Aegean and a local power, looking for political and military access to the Mediterranean, being, quote unquote, asphyxiated by the Greek islands, breathing in her face. Unfortunately, the actors of this tragedy could not conceive at the time the consequences of their destructive policies that caused this devastating defeat. Every tragedy of this magnitude usually ends up in some kind of a catharsis. The execution of the six was the main ingredient of this catharsis. But we'll talk about this another time. The British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, describing this tragic event, wrote, "Every tragedy is a mixture of mistakes and misadventures. Never before has this phenomenon been better depicted more fully than the Greek misfortune in this war." And thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Peter, for that. Very, very interesting. But to the British, okay, I just have to add this to the British, and also to the other allies, okay, who were part of this. And to Ismeni's point, was a continuation of World War I. They wanted someone else to be there, and they were never there for the Hellenic people. As a matter of fact, prior to the start of World War I, they had spoken to Venizelos and had told them to join and others to join the war, and they would give them Cyprus. When they in fact ended up joining the war, and when they went back and asked them for Cyprus, they said, no, it's too late. So there are many ways to look at it. And not only that, we talk about the Megali there and what the Greeks did and this and that, without taking into account what the Allies did and how they were part of it. Also, when we talk about irredentism, we have to think of Ziga Gopal, for example, and his concept and principles of Turkism. So there was counter scenarios, and the genocide that we're talking about did not happen because of the Greeks in 1919 and the Megali there, but in fact, to everyone's research, the genocide started in the 1890s. It started with the Armenians in Anatolia, and there's a whole history, not only with the Armenians, but also with the Greeks of Thrace, etc., prior to World War I and during World War I. But regardless of that, we'll get back to that.
Yes, I had to leave all that out because it was a 45-minute presentation.
No, I apologize. We'll get to
that. I had to concentrate on the Megali there. I could say a lot about the Brits and the French.
I know that. In terms of the audience.
But thank you for mentioning that.
In terms of the Megali there, I have to mention to the audience that the Megali there came out actually after the revolution, and it was also a concept and a thought philosophically that was also in the universities at the time, in particular, not only the islands that were mentioned before, but also in Athens. Okay, it was a concept to get back the areas where the Hellenic people were, and but that's a different discussion. So we're not gonna get into that. But maybe during the period when we have an open discussion. Our next presenter is Dr. Panayotis Diamadis, who's coming from Australia. Everyone, okay? So we have people in different locations. We have Peter, who's in Florida. We have Ismini, who's in Washington. We have Panayoti, who's in Australia, and we have Sava. Sava, where are you now? Where are you now, Sava?
I'm in Chicago. Chicago.
It's Saba from Chicago. So,
Yeah.
It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Panayotis Diamadis. He was born and raised in Sydney, Australia, to migrants from Yanina and Agrinio in mainland Greece. He was educated at the University of Sydney, from which he graduated with a PhD in genocide studies. His research focuses on the Australian Hellenic relationship, particularly around the period of the genocide of Hellenes, 1914 to 24. Dr. Diamadis is an active member of the Australian Hellenic community for 33 years, starting out from his folkloric dance group. He has participated in SAE Oceania in international conferences and served for many years in the Australian Hellenic Council. Panayoti has been an AHEPN since 1991, and from 2013 has been the Secretary of the Order of AHEPA, New South Wales. He will be speaking on the roles of Americans and Australians in inspiring humanitarian relief efforts on behalf of the survivors. The title of his presentation is True Leadership, American and Australian Relief Efforts for Survivors of the Genocides. Panayoti, thank you for being with us. And thank you also for being in the last panel discussion we had a few months ago. Panayoti.
Thank you once again for the invitation, Lou. Kalimera from Sydney. It's Monday morning here. As some of you will know, the difference between Sydney and the east coast of the States is 14 hours. We're 14 hours ahead the way the Earth spins. It is tradition in Australia that we recognise the Indigenous peoples of the First Nations of Australia before we speak. So I recognise the Eora people, the Indigenous traditional owners of the area where I live in Sydney, and acknowledge their leaders past and present and emerging. I believe it's important that we do that, and I say this at every event that we do in Sydney or anywhere in Australia, because as we should be demanding as a people, the recognition of the Hellenes as the Indigenous peoples of Thraci, Mikrasia, Pondos, and Cappadocia. We need to acknowledge other Indigenous peoples as well. There's so many points that both Ismini and Panayoti raised that I wish I had time to comment on and to unpack, but I don't, so I'll stick to my theme, which draws from both, but especially from Ismini's. Horton was only the most famous of a substantial number of Americans particularly, but also Australians, and you'll be surprised, some of you may be surprised, New Zealanders who were in leadership positions during the genocide period, not just in and around Smyrni, starting off earlier and continuing for many years later. His book, and Ismini, I was just looking at Recollections, Grave and Gay. That's the book I was looking at while you were speaking, and flicking through a later book from The Blight of Asia. For those of you who don't know, it's less well known than The Blight of Asia, in which he actually spends a fair bit of time talking about his time in Thessaloniki. Look, Horton wrote a lot as a diplomat. From my point of view, the more important ones for our discussion today are the people who were involved on the ground, not in the halls of power, but actually dealing with the impacts of the decisions of the halls of power on the ground in Mikrasia, in Thraci. And let's not forget that Constantinople constitutes part of Thraci. It's not part of Mikrasia. People that Horton had dealings with, from the American side, Asa Jennings is a very famous one during the evacuation of the survivors of Smyrni. And just a few days ago, we had the passing, the death, and the funeral on Thursday of Mikis Theodorakis. Not very well known is that his mother was a survivor of the genocide. His mother was born in a little town called Agia Paraskeve, essentially a part now of what we call Kato Panagia, what in Turkish is known as Çeşme, across just across the strait from Chios, which is why Theodorakis himself was actually born on Chios, although the family was from Crete, to link in again with the Venizelos and the leadership, the Cretan leadership. We also, in many ways, the genocide of the Hellenes, the Armenians, and the Assyrians, and that trio, η τριάδα, should always be referred to together, because we are dealing with the same perpetrators in the same time frame and in the same territory. As has been discussed, has been mentioned, started long before Mustafa Kemal came on the scene. And little sidebar, because I know Lou loves his sidebars, his tangents. Mustafa Kemal was not born in Thessaloniki. He was born in a Chorio, a little village in the Lagada district behind Thessaloniki. The family home is now just a pile of stones. Even most of those stones have been removed to use for other purposes. We actually have no extra evidence that he actually ever spent a single night living in that, where the consulate is now in Agio Dimitrios Street in Thessaloniki. It was a gift from Venizelos as part of the rapprochement process. So there was a lot of mythology around the man Mustafa Kemal, the grey wolf, who was neither grey nor a wolf, but that's another issue. We have, by 1915, at least in Australia, and this comes out essentially from what became the Near East Relief Organization in the United States, a series of ad hoc committees appearing, fundraising here in Australia in 1915, 1916, 1917, during World War I, fundraising not for the needs of the Australian forces on the Western Front, at Gallipoli, and in the Middle East, but fundraising for what we now know as the survivors of the genocides, relief efforts. At the end of 1918, once the war in the West, as Ismini quite correctly pointed out, concluded, one of the first actions of the City of Sydney Council was to bring these ad hoc organizations together. Literally a month after the war concluded on the 11th of November, 1918. On the 12th of December, the City of Sydney, the Lord Mayor of Sydney, brought together these ad hoc committees and formed the Near East Relief Organization in Australia. So the Near East Relief that you know of, based in New York, the Australian branch was formed here in Australia, formed here in Sydney in 1918. Now, if there was no need for such committees, why form them? So we already have these refugees, we already have these survivors of massive atrocities by the end of the war in the West. So the argument that the genocide was the result of the presence of Hellenic forces, military forces in Mikra Asia, is complete bunkum, and is one of the great myths perpetrated by the propaganda machine, essentially, of Ankara. One of the leaders of this movement in Australia was an American, a reverend, and I think you guys would call him Episcopalian, a Protestant minister, Loyal Lincoln Wirt, W-I-R-T. His descendants still live, and Sava, I think you might be interested. I think they are actually in the Midwest. I think they're in your part of the United States. Who actually travelled here? He travelled via Hawaii, from San Francisco to Hawaii, to New Zealand first, and then to Australia, to organise these relief efforts, these relief committees. And this is 1921, 1922. And out of Wirt's travels here to Australia, apart from this relief work, he also started what we would call kindergartens, childcare. He actually started the childcare movement in Australia. Emerged other characters, other personalities, such as the Reverend Cresswell, who went backwards and forwards from the Middle East, particularly Armenia and Syria, to Australia, ferrying backwards and forwards relief supplies, donations of flour, of clothes, not so much of cash, but in the more immediate needs, particularly in light of the Holocaust of Smyrna. And I deliberately use that word, small h Holocaust. This is how it was described, and I'm sure you've all seen the National Geographic report on the destruction of Smyrna, published in November 1925. If you don't have a copy, you can buy one. I think it's around it's now up to about $110 on eBay. Excuse me. It's 52 pages long. It's written by Melville Chater. It has amazing, most amazing and graphic photographs taken by American photographers in Smyrna at the time of the catastrophe, of the destruction of the city. And it actually calls it a Holocaust and Lokaftoma because the place was burned. These images triggered in many ways what we now understand of as humanitarianism, as the role of the media in humanitarian relief. From New Zealand, we had, apart from these donations, we also had important people like the Knudsen couple, married couple, who ran an orphanage outside Beirut. Now it's part of the city of Beirut, at a place called Tuprofiti Ilia, Antelias. It's now the headquarters of the Armenian Church in Lebanon. Back then, it was an orphanage run exclusively and funded by donations from Australia for over a decade. It did not close until 1930. Combination of the children who were housed there growing up, and also the impacts of the beginnings of the Great Depression, the Wall Street crash of 1929. But the premises are still there, and the legacy is still there. And a number of those orphans who were at that orphanage eventually later migrated to Australia, and their descendants I associate with quite regularly here. From New Zealand, during the catastrophe, we have the most graphic account by an Anglican priest, the Anglican priest of St. John's in Smyrna at the time. He was New Zealand born, but he married a Greek woman. He married a lady of Constantinople, and their granddaughter, Joanna Hislop, now in London, is working on developing her grandfather's memoirs and letters, and talking about what he actually saw in Smyrna during the catastrophe. And he, with Horton and with his, and as Ismini pointed out, is categorical, absolutely categorical. The city was intact when the last Greek unit left the city. The fire started 4 days after Kemal's forces entered the city. Now, this is not some random person. This guy was actually in the city at the time. He buried people in the cemetery of St. John's, which I don't think exists anymore, who had been murdered by, I won't say Turkish, I will say Muslim, mobs in the city. The concept of Turk is a nebulous one, which we'll talk about at another time. In Smyrna Harbour, we have the famous Japanese ship that dumped its cargo to take on refugees. Just under 900 people were brought to Piraeus by this Japanese ship. We still don't know the captain's name. We've not been able to identify the captain's name, although there are Japanese scholars now looking into it, the ship's records, but they can't find the individual's name. But the most important, and I will close, I'm looking at the time now, the most important aspects about true leadership, the American and Australian, particularly the American leadership with regards to helping, to assisting the survivors of the genocide, was the impact it had on what we now understand of as humanitarian aid. We're all, and a number of the audience will be the right generation to remember a character both from film but also from television, called Uncle Fester. A couple of smiles, I see. Uncle Fess's real name was Jackie Coogan. Jackie Coogan was a child star in the 1920s who launched what he called literally children's crusades, children's campaigns on behalf of the child survivors of the genocides. There is footage, there are a number of photographs of him going across the country. Just imagine Uncle Fester, but with hair. Back in the days when he had a bob haircut. Fundraising and raising amazing amounts of money and donations of corn and flour and other things that were shipped to Greece for the survivors, and also to Syria, which was the second biggest center of survivors, mostly of Armenians and Assyrians from just the geography of the region. They found refuge in French-controlled Syria, but also in what is now Israel, in Jerusalem. This story is not just from a historical point of view. This is not just the story of the humanitarian relief aid is not just historical. It set, as I've said, I think 3 times now, it set the standard for what is considered today a successful humanitarian relief campaign. It showed the power of what we now understand as social media. Long before Facebook existed, long before Instagram or any of these social media, the power of the visual image was reinforced in the campaign on behalf of the survivors. Now, this is material that we need to be using, particularly in the United States, in our campaign for justice. The only justice that we are now allowed is the justice of recognition. President Biden finally did what most American presidents before him have failed to do, which was formally recognize, let's put it that way, acknowledge the genocide of the Armenian people. Next year, for the centenary of the Holocaust of Smyrna, let's hope he has the courage to do the same with Smyrna and with the genocide of the Hellenes. This is up to us, both us from Australia, but particularly you from America, using, I'm sure what Sava's going to be talking about with the Naval Diaries, Horton, from Ismini's book on Horton and other work, with a campaign to show why this material, this history, these stories are American stories, as much as they are Hellenic or Armenian stories or Assyrian stories. I've been working on it for many years, a unique collection, absolutely unique collection of photographs taken in the first days of the survivors coming to Greece. Not so much from Smyrna, which is why I haven't spent much time on it, talking about it, but particularly from Anatoliki Thraki and Pontos. They were taken by an Australian who had served with the British forces. He actually met Kemal on a few occasions, although we're having real trouble finding evidence for it. It's almost definite he was working for the British military intelligence at the time, before he resigned his commission in 1921 and spent the next few years working as the League of Nations Commissioner for Refugees in particularly Macedonia and Thraki, particularly Thraki, based in Thessaloniki, and Komotini was where his office was. Over 100 photographs, most of them have never been published, of the first days. So we're talking about October of 1922. His name was George Divine Trelaw. His son, one of his sons, who was born in Thessaloniki, only passed away last month at the age of 94. And I'm working with his youngest son to produce these photographs and publish them as a collection. I got to close. Now I could go on forever, but I've got to close. Thanking my very good friend and colleague Viken Babkenyan, who has done a lot of work, and he's actually lectured on this in Los Angeles. Who's done a lot of work on the relief committees. And if you talking of books, if you want one that looks at the Australian and the American connection better, Armenia, Australia, and the Great War is a great read by Piquen that shows in great detail the way the influence of the American women, particularly the Protestant women activists, and the way they influenced American and Australian attitudes and responses to the genocides of our peoples. Eoniotis Imnimi, thank you once again for the invitation, Lou, and fraternal greetings from HEPA New South Wales to the parent organization in the United States.
Thank you so much, Panayoti, for that. You did mention, of course, the Toki Maru, which was the Japanese ship that you were referring to, that saved about 800 and some odd, 822, I think it was, Hellenes and Armenians. I did have the pleasure of meeting in Tokyo with Dr. Sana Yanagi, who actually had done the research that you were referring to in terms of the ship. And we will be entering the 99th year. We are in the 99th year. We will be entering to the 100th year of this particular catastrophe. But also we're entering into the 100-year anniversary in the United States of HEPA.
Yep.
So this is the 99th year also of HEPA, not only of the genocide. And also the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese here in the United States. So that's a different topic, but quite frankly, the 99 years going into the 100 years of these particular organizations, we'll discuss a little bit in the open panel discussion in a few minutes. I'd like to introduce now our next presenter, Savas Sam Kotsoglu. He is the co-author of an acclaimed book, The Greek Genocide in American Naval War Diaries, Naval Commanders Report and Protest, Death Marches and Massacres in Turkey's Pontus region, 1921-1922. He is a retired mechanical engineer. He received his engineering degrees from Villanova University and the University of Pennsylvania, and has worked in senior level engineering positions in both the private and government sectors of the United States and also internationally. He has been active in various capacities in a number of Chicago area non-for-profit organizations. Prior to his engineering career, he served as a second lieutenant in the special forces of the Greek Army Reserves. The subject of his talk will be on his book, which I also bought a copy of, so everybody understands, and I highly recommend it, obviously. His talk will be on his book, The Greek Genocide in American Naval War Diaries, which he co-authored with the late Dr. Robert Schenck, and which has been published in 2020 by the University of New Orleans. Sava.
Thank you, Lou. And I'd like to also to thank the MBCA for inviting me to be on the panel today in commemorating the 99th anniversary of the Great Fire and Destruction of Smyrna. As you know, the destruction and the exodus from Smyrna was the last phase of the Greek genocide of 1914-1923, which also marked the end of Hellenism in Asia Minor. Turkey's actions not only resulted in genocides, but created humanitarian crises of unprecedented proportions in the course of her campaign to exterminate its Christian minorities. To this day, Turkey not only denies these genocides, but continues to add more international crimes and violations to her record. You have probably heard the expression, Turkey does not have a history, it has a criminal record. I will begin by introducing the book, which I co-authored with the late Dr. Robert Schenck, and which was published by the University of New Orleans Press in 1920. If times allows, I will share parts of the testimony of Dr. Esther Lovejoy, which is in the epilogue of our book. The testimony's title is The Horror on the Smyrna Quay. It is from chapter 16 of her book, Certain Samaritans, published in 1933. I happen to have actually a used copy of her book, which is signed by Dr. Lovejoy to a lady who purchased it in 1934. I can share maybe if I manage. Here is the book. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see it?
No, not yet. No, we
Oh.
can't see.
Oh, okay, yeah, because I guess I didn't use the share function. Let me, share a screen. Let's see. Well, somehow it disappeared from my, let's see, show all windows. Should be here, but anyway. The title of the book, which I co-authored with the late Dr. Schenk, is The Greek Genocide in American Naval War Diaries, Naval Commanders Report and Protest Death Marches and Massacres in Pontus, in Turkish Pontus region. Unlike most books, the manuscript of this one was vetted academically before the university undertook to publish it. The process involved a rigorous peer review that confirmed its original content and contribution to the historical record. The book is a collection of archival naval documents called War Diaries, dating to 1921 and 1922. The diaries are located in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. These documents were detailed accounts of events and occurrences in the city of Samson and its region. Specifically, these were reports by mid-level American naval officers about massacres, deportations, and the burning of hundreds of Greek villages. Also reports of many other atrocities which were perpetrated against the Greek minority in the Pontus region. The diaries provide a continuous account of what was going on in one of the most prominent ports of Anatolia. Samson was a major port on the Black Sea that provided the earliest access, the easiest access to the interior of Anatolia for the nationalists, American missionaries, and relief workers. It was not a coincidence that Mustafa Kemal got off a ship at Samson before he continued to go to the interior of Anatolia to implement his plans. We made every effort that the book is fair and balanced in presenting the war diaries and other details pertaining to these events. We have not cherry-picked the diaries, in other words, to include only those which mention the Turkish atrocities, but also the protests of dissident Turks who were against the deportations and who did this at great personal risk. We have also included diaries which mention the activities of the Greek Andartes in the area of Samson, not so favorable for us. Anyway, it's important to note that to this day, the book has received positive reviews. Professor Thomas Blake Earl of Texas A&M University ends his review as follows. For policymakers, service members, and researchers alike, this collection is a valuable resource. There is ample evidence in the diaries that the Turkish actions against the Greeks in Asia Minor was constituted genocide. Because some scholars question the use of the term genocide in this case, I would like to mention here our reasoning for the use of the word. For that we are not only considered the current legal, for that we don't only consider the current legal definition of genocide, but went back to see how Raphael Lemkin defined it. Although the word genocide itself did not exist until Raphael Lemkin coined it during World War II, from what the naval officers here were hearing and seeing, most of them concluded very early on that the Turkish policies were intended to exterminate the Ottoman Greeks in Anatolia. The word extermination appears in a number of war diaries and similar comments appear in several later war diaries. It's easy to see that such a policy of extermination amounted virtually to the same thing that modern scholars now denote by the term genocide. Indeed, the terms we found in the diaries parallel close to those of the originator of the term in his own definition. For instance, the same word, extermination, appears in the English version of Lemkin's 1945 proposal to the United Nations for an International Treaty on Genocide, as was published in the April 1946 American Scholar. His proposal stated, the crime of genocide should be recognized as a conspiracy to exterminate national, religious, or racial groups. The overt acts of such conspiracy may consist of attacks against life, liberty, or property of members of such groups merely because of their affiliation with such groups. Should someone ask what our, as authors of the book, definition of genocide is, we would refer to this definition of Lemkin's. It is important to note, in connection with this original formulation, that attacks against life, liberty, and property, such as Lemkin denotes above as qualifying actions to be genocidal, are all three described in the war diaries frequently taking place in the Pontus region in 1921 and 1922. Even if we wish to consider the current legal definition of genocide, which was established at the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, the Turkish campaign of extermination against the Greek population of Anatolia meets the two main criteria, which are the intent to destroy and the physical aspect, which was the killing of hundreds of thousands of non-combatants by various means. One very important incriminating element that proves further our claim of genocide, and which arises from the diaries, is that the orders for the campaign of extermination, specifically the mass deportation of non-combatants, originated in Ankara, the center of the nationalist government. This was stated several times to the protesting American officers by the local nationalist political leaders in Samsun. From this, we conclude that the campaign of extermination was centrally planned and directed. The apologists for the Turks cannot claim that the massacres and deportations were spontaneous actions by local Turkish individuals or officials. We trust that this book will help our cause in the recognition of the Greek genocide, as our fellow Americans and our government will have in their hands a book with undeniable evidence as documented by the American Navy officers. I will now read parts of Dr. Lovejoy's testimony. Her testimony about Smyrna is several chapters in her book, Certain Samaritans. First, some information about Dr. Lovejoy. Dr. Lovejoy was a physician and the head of the Medical Women's International Association, which is in the first week of September 1922, was conferencing in Geneva with similar groups. Her colleagues there were all American and Canadian women MDs who, when they found out that women nurses but no women doctors would be allowed in the United States Army at the outbreak of World War I, decided to build their own organizations. Within a little more than a year, several fine American and Canadian women doctor volunteers found themselves providing hospital care and other services for American and Ottoman Greek refugees throughout Anatolia. Dr. Lovejoy eventually wrote a stunning book about her experiences. The book title was Certain Samaritans. Actually, as I indicated, I think I happen to have a copy, a used copy. On hearing of the terrible fire in Smyrna in mid-September 1922, Lovejoy immediately traveled to Constantinople, and then on a freighter that quickly took her to Smyrna, even while the inferno was still simmering. For several days, Lovejoy immersed herself as a doctor in the unspeakable squalor, anxiety, despair, and tragedy of the Smyrna Quay. The only American woman to be found there, Lovejoy helped pregnant women as best as she could, gazed at the infernal gates, the Turks had set up on the quay, listened to the terrible nightly shrieks that Ernest Hemingway would write about later, but without comprehension, he had not been there, and daily labored alongside American sailors and officers of the American destroyer Litchfield and a few relief workers. Most of these Americans were doing all they could to help more than 200,000 Greeks and Armenians huddled there, many of whose lives were in great danger. A very intelligent and observant witness, Lovejoy, but by turns effectively expresses outrage, compassion, cynicism, and deep irony in describing the terrible events that had taken place before her very eyes. Do I have time to go on, Lou?
Please, we're not going to cut you off. And if you have a second, just discuss briefly, if you can, your personal involvement in this with regards to your family in terms of the genocide.
Yes, there's a personal component into this, in the sense that both sides of my family, my parents' families, were victims of the genocide. My father was from a very small village near Samson in Pontus, and his entire village was destroyed and the inhabitants massacred. He and two women were the only survivors of the village. The village was called Adak, which in Greek means island. And he was lucky because he happened to leave from the village the day before. He went up in the mountains, and the next day when they came down with his uncle and the other men that were up in the mountains, they saw, blood all over the place. Even the water in the river nearby was all, red from the blood of the victims. And so what they did, the Turks, is they surrounded the village. They put and had the people in a few homes, and they set them on fire. And anyone who tried to escape, they would shoot, or they would, kill with any possible way. That was the story of my father, who ended up coming to Greece as a young man of, I think, about 15 years old, with nobody. He was alone, and he started his life again, alone. And fortunately, he was, I guess, smart enough and industrious enough to make it in Greece and have a family and so forth and so on. Now, my mother's side, was from another time. It was a town in Pontus called Faza, and he was a businessman. Actually, he happens to have, can you imagine, I have a business card of his, 100 years old. That's to show you that how prosperous were Greeks, in other words, at that time. Anyway, he was arrested on the 25th of March of 1921, and he was taken to Amasya, and he was executed on September 21st of 1921, along with other 177 Pontian Greek notables. And that was the story of my mother's side. And of course, my grandmother with 3 kids. My mother was 12 years old. Her brothers were even younger than her. Came to Greece, and the story is, and then he became, of course, one of my uncles became the abbot in the monastery of Panagia Soumela in Greece. So that's the story, the personal story of my family in this context of the genocide, in other words.
So what we can see, and what we've discussed, even though we're here today to talk about the 99th commemoration, let's say, of the burning of Smyrna, that was towards the tail end of the genocide. So we had, for the audience, we've had no one knows really how many people were murdered, killed through death marches and many other very bad things.
Mhm.
But approximate estimates, and I believe these numbers are low, by the way. We're talking about 1.5 million Armenians, about 900,000, which I think is low for Greeks, and about 750,000 Assyrians. So we're talking about over 3 million people. I think that the Israeli professors who came out with their book,
Yeah.
The 30-Year Genocide, where they actually started to look at this as a systemic scenario, not something that
Yeah.
just happened, but they were talking, and if you go into the research and all the rest of that, and back to Panayoti's point,
Yeah.
that we're talking about 1894, okay, 1894. And then we discussed
Yeah.
Venizelos and all the rest of that.
Mm.
And we do know that these genocides were taking place early on, before Greece entered the war, before Greece entered World War I. As a matter of fact, they sent messages out and said, listen, you guys better stop this genocide that you're having in Thracia, etc. So, and in terms of the Germans, I think the fact that some of the speakers, in particular, I think Ismini mentioned it, the Germans were there, okay? And there's plenty of references to the Germans actually helping, of the period, helping out the Turks with regards to strategies in terms of how to commit genocide and termination of the Hellenic population. And as a matter of fact, they started, why do we know so much about the Armenians? Because you guys can go into it in a second. But we know a lot about the Armenians because the Armenians, quite frankly, many of them, also had converted into Protestantism. And there were a lot of Protestant, people there with Armenian communities at that particular time. And a lot was written by the Armenians. Less was written by the Greeks because they also had a problem with people trying to proselytize them. So we don't know a lot about these other people. But back to Savas's, documents, there's also a great book called American Accounts Documenting the Destruction of Smyrna by the Kemalist Turkish Forces, September 1922, edited by Konstantin Hadzidimitriou. Konstantin obviously has appeared with us on numerous occasions, and here's the book. If people can find it, I would recommend it. What I want to do now is go into an open panel discussion. We'll have an open panel discussion right now. And Ismini, let me ask you a question. If you can, just go off mute. When is your book coming out, by the way?
Sorry. Hopefully in the next 6 or 7 months. I don't have an exact date yet.
All right. We would like the book to come out on the 100th anniversary, obviously, which is coming up next year. We talked about the 99th anniversary, or in terms of not only the Smyrna catastrophe, but also a HEPA, and we also discussed the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese here. We mentioned a HEPA, and we mentioned obviously all of them going into the 100th year. Let me ask everyone a question here, because one of the things that was in my mind as everyone was speaking was that there has to be a mission. There has to be a mission internationally, I think, with regards to the 100th year anniversary of not necessarily that it's Smyrna, but it was the last major aspect of the genocide before the transformation or the population exchange, let's say in 1923. So the thought in my mind is Ismini and Panayoti and Sava and Peter is that for the next year we somehow try to link, as we're heading into the 100th anniversary of both HEPA and Smyrna and all the rest of that, to create pressure with regards to the genocide. And to Ismini's point, and to Panayoti's point, what we did, EMCA, what we did is that within the last year, we did many programs regarding the 100th anniversary of the Hellenic Revolution. And what we tried to do is tie it into America, not only what happened in Greece with the Greeks. And to Panayoti's point, okay, we have to make it an issue of the genocide as being also a genocide that both America, Australia, New Zealand, or what have you, and their relatives were part of these relief efforts and were totally part of what was going on in terms of helping out with a genocide that they recognize. Panayoti, would you like to comment on that?
I think you've summed it up, Lou. Okay, as I said before, these stories are Australian history, they're American history, they're New Zealand history. The genocide period that we are talking about, the late teens and the early 20s, set the model for what we now understand of as humanitarian relief, of social media. In so many ways, they changed the way that international society worked. It was the first time, the very first time, that you had an international effort, coordinated effort across national borders for a specific cause that was not a military campaign. Think about in the course of human history, this is the first time it happened. This is how big the news was. And I think this is the way we've succeeded in getting some genocide recognition resolutions up in parliaments here in Australia. Like the United States, Australia is a federal system. And is by making it relevant to the local communities. And to pick up your point, Lou, about the Germans, a whole range of the photographs that we have from the period before Smidny, so before 1922, that we sometimes use, and they appear in books as, this is from Gerasunda, this is from Bondos, this is from whatever. They're actually Armenians, they're not Greeks. And this is because the German soldiers who were in Bondos, in Mikrasia, in Thraki, were photographing quite openly and quite proudly, sending these photographs back to Germany, where they were being published, and they were turning public opinion against the government's policy of supporting the Ottoman Empire. So when it came time once the Armenians had been destroyed by about 1916, 1917 onwards, 1917 to about 1922, there are very, very few photographs of that period, because there was a campaign by the German military authorities to stop their soldiers taking these photographs, because they were doing so much damage back in the States, back in the homeland in Germany. I had the privilege of working with for a while. We've now gone separate ways. The granddaughter of a man called Johannes Lepsius, who was the most prominent of these German missionaries that you were talking about, Luke, in Anatolia at the time. And he wrote meticulous documents and meticulous records, so meticulous that the Ottoman Empire expelled him. He had to relocate to Germany. He had to basically go home, because his writings in 1915, 1916 were so damaging to the relationship between the two countries. We should not underestimate this social history and the power of it a century later, especially in the current context. You quite correctly mentioned the Afghan evacuation, airlift, however you want to phrase it, and the images. And I think it was Ismini that brought it up. Of babies being handed over. We have exactly the same stories from Smidny. We had 9/11 just a couple of days, well, my time 2 days ago, your time yesterday. And these events were driven by the same extreme political ideology. Let's not make no mistake, and I think all the panelists have alluded to it. Kemalist ideology is an extreme form of ethnic nationalism. The resurgence today of pseudo-Turkology, I mean, I was reading an article just yesterday, which was published in July, and I'll share the link of there are now universities in not only in Ankara and other cities of the country, but in places like Kazakhstan, promoting what they call history in inverted commas, that Jesus was Turkish. Oh, I'm not kidding you. This is being taught as history.
Mhm.
That the ancestral homeland of the Sumerians, you know, the ancient people of the first civilizations in Iraq, and what we now call Iraq, were Turkish. They were originally from Kazakhstan. The old one about the Olympic Games being on Mount Olympus in Bithynia behind Troy. The old Sun language theory, all this stuff started with Kemal. It all started in the 1920s and 1930s. And there's a big resurgence of it now.
But it wasn't so much Kemal as we indicated earlier. You know, Ziga Gökalp, who I mentioned, that's who Kemal was into. You know, his concept of Turkism, and they're taking it to like a fanatical level. I think the DNA studies now are starting to complicate people's brains. But let me ask a question of Peter. Peter, let me ask you a question. Why, in spite of all this, okay, that other people have written about, why did it take Greece so long to recognize the genocides that we're talking about formally? Why did it take so long?
Well, first of all, it happened in the 90s, and this is due to the continual, I would say, attempts by the Pontian organized societies. And this movement, I just want to let the other members of this distinguished panel to know that it started in New York. It started in Astoria, where we had the Pontian Federation annual convention. And that's when this dream was formed. And then in 1985, Lou, we have our first World Council of Pontian Hellenes in Thessaloniki. That was 1985, and the following one was in 1988, and the rest is history. So again, this movement starts from abroad, from the Hellenes of the diaspora.
That's right. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
It almost seems to me, everyone, it almost seems to me, and your opinions, please jump in anytime you want. It almost seems to me like you're correct, Peter. It starts from the diaspora. The diaspora is talking about these things. Even when we were discussing the Hellenic Revolution over the last year, we started here in the US about a year ago, leading to the 100th anniversary. And we talked about different angles and different aspects of it. We're in Las, that it was the 200th anniversary of the Hellenic Revolution. They couldn't get it off the ground.
That's
now,
right.
in terms of the genocide, though, it really is disturbing when you start to recognize how long it took them to, in fact, acknowledge the genocide, and do it in a slow motion type thing. I can't comprehend it. The other thing, yeah, please, Seva.
First of all, one of the reasons I'd like to say something about what Panagiotis was saying regarding the censorship. In other words, specifically in the book that I co-authored, any mail that was arriving from Constantinople to be delivered to the American businessmen, Samson, and the relief workers, was going through a censor.
Yeah.
So they were not allowed, in other words, and the same thing the other way. In other words, any mail of any of Americans, whether businessmen or missionary workers or relief workers, had to go through censorship before it got on a boat to go to Constantinople, in other words. So they were very, very strict on that, and that's why we do not have photographs of the events. In other words, I personally went to, when I went to the National Archives to photograph the diaries, I looked for photographs. Unfortunately, there weren't any. Then I went to the University of Maryland, which is another section of the National Archives. I looked there, I found a lot of Navy related photographs, but almost nothing about the events of, the massacres and deportations and this and that.
Well, Sava, to your point, what it demonstrates is that this was strategic on their part.
Yes.
That in fact it was absolutely planned. It was absolutely planned
Oh, yes.
to have the
Oh, yes.
genocide, and they knew it was wrong. They knew it was wrong, and they tried to hide and as a matter of fact destroy the records. People try to find out the records, let's say, of Kemal, what he sent to his troops, etc. Nobody can seem to find stuff. Okay, in terms of the burning of Smyrna, for example. So it's amazing. But the other thing to keep in mind, back to Izmini's point about the so-called allies, it's obvious. It's obvious that they are also involved in the process of keeping the information away from the people and the recognition of the genocide. There's no doubt in my mind. As a matter of fact, when we were doing all these events on the Hellenic Revolution, it becomes obvious, even though we say the American people supported the revolution. What becomes obvious, even though they quote senators and they quote the president, etc., at the time period, it becomes obvious that the merchants of Boston who were involved in the opium trade, in other words, buying opium from Turkey and selling it to China for 4 times the amount, had more of an influence on the government of the United States than the people of the United States. So there's a lot of things that are always kept away from the people. But the thing that's disturbing to me is the Hellenic people themselves. The Hellenic people themselves did not recognize these genocides. And they, I believe, I shouldn't say the people, the government, I believe that they themselves did not want to create issues with Turkey with regards to the issue of genocide.
Can I say something?
Let me say
Please,
something.
everybody, one by one, and go ahead.
I've been involved with this from the get-go, and I saw quite a few things that were extremely disappointing. First of all, it took us quite a few years, Lou, to be the evangelists to the rest of the Hellenes, and for them to understand that this is not a Pontian or Asia Minor issue at the time. It's a Hellenic issue. It's an ecumenical Hellenic issue.
Yep.
So that took quite a few years. As I'm saying, in 1988, we decided unanimously in Thessaloniki, the whole Pontian conference, that our biggest intent, our biggest issue, our biggest concern is for the recognition, the ecumenical recognition of the genocide. But first, we had to convince the Hellenes. We had to teach them, for them to understand that it's ethniko thema, it's a national issue.
Yes.
So,
Izmini, you were going to say something, and then Sava, if you can. Izmini.
Yes. Well, I must say that I'm not all that surprised that it was not recognized even earlier by the Greek government. And part of it is education. I don't think that the average Greek knows a whole lot about it. And I can give you my personal example. I do not recall growing up in the 60s and the 70s, being in school, being taught the truth, as it were. You knew a few things, you did not know details. And again, going back to the truth and echoing to what a lot of you have already touched upon, if you do not know the truth, then how are you going to do something about it? So that's part of it. And I think it extends to what we can do today. With the 100th anniversary coming up of Smyrna, and the concept of genocide is not just official recognitions from governments, but to try and educate as many people as we can around the world, in our realm, wherever we are, Australia, America, Africa, Greece, wherever, South Africa, Greeks are everywhere. We need to raise awareness. People do not know very much about it. Therefore, they're not going to stand up and recognize it.
Yes.
Sava.
I want to go back to the reason why it was not, didn't become, in other words, popular or known, the events of genocide. One of the reasons was that the people, the refugees who came, in other words, they had lost most men were dead. So it was mostly women, widows with children. So these people, these women, and with their children, were trying to build their lives again. So they didn't have any, spare time, let's say, and a lot of them were not educated to the level that they were able to advocate, in other words, and say, wait a minute, this is what happened to us. Why don't you guys do something about it? So that was one reason, is because people were trying to rebuild their lives, especially women and children. And the other reason was it was the government itself. In other words, in 1930, there was a treaty with Turkey, friendship. And it's also known that Venizelos also
There was an issue there.
Proposed that Kemal get.
No,
so
but
it was a government thing also to put this, sweep this under the rug.
But then
and-
again, there was discrimination. There was discrimination of the people who came from Turkey anyway. These were the so-called Yaurtofagades
Yes.
and all these other type of issues. that took place.
Yes.
In
Exactly.
addition-
Panayotti.
Yeah.
In addition to what Sava said before, and by the way, I didn't know Sava is Temeteron. You know what Temeteron means?
Well, that's a long story, but
Yes,
anyway.
but yes. But the thing is that, as he said before very correctly, what I would like to add is that the elite was eradicated.
Yes.
That in every genocide or democide, the oppressor starts from the head, from the kefali της κοινωνίας, from the head, from the upper society, from the educated people, the priests, the professionals, the professors, the academics. And that's exactly what happened, especially in Pondos. They eradicated the elite. So there was just very few educated people that came from, they brought their culture, they brought their religion, they brought their dances, they brought their history, but it took them 2 or 3 generations to recover. And that's what we have to understand. And here we are in the 80s, the 70s and the 80s, we are the 3rd generation now. And we're more educated. We're in the diaspora in conjunction with our colleagues and compatriotes, Pondians from the mainland, who are also professors like Professor Enepekidis, Polychronis Enepekidis, who was from Vienna. He was a forerunner in this. And then, of course, came my friend Kostas Fotiadis, my friend Vlasis Hatzidis, and so many others that I have met over the years, and I collaborated with them. So it took a few generations to recover and to be able to claim what they lost, to claim and set the history straight. So what I suggest in the future, we can also collaborate with Turkish intellectuals who want to dig in and come up with the true history. I suggest strongly that, if possible, to reach out to them and include them in some of our panel discussions.
I agree, and I'll make my suggestions in a second. But before we continue, I'd like to wrap it up. So I'm sorry, Zminia, I cut you off. Please.
No, I said couldn't agree more. And there are many Turkish scholars who have admitted to the genocide, and their research again truthfully done and the way it should be done. They have accepted what happened, and Taner Aknam is one of the most well-known ones, but there are quite a few, and I read more and more articles and so on by Turkish intellectuals who are willing to recognize what happened, and it has happened, it has come up in their research. So it would be a great idea to reach out to them and work on it together. That's a
Okay,
great idea, Peter.
One last one.
We're gonna wrap it up now. So if we can, find
Just
some fun.
one thing I would like to say.
We'll get to you in 1 second. So,
Okay.
Panayoti, if you would like to, just make some concluding remarks, we'll get to you, Sava, just 1 second.
Okay, sure.
Panayoti, some concluding remarks.
Australian Panayoti or American
Australian Panayoti, Australian Panayoti.
Concluding remarks. We have a very difficult year behind us. We have a very difficult year ahead of us. Difficult year, obviously, with COVID. Australia is still cut off from the rest of the world physically. We have no international travel, so our access to records and to research is pretty much frozen for a while. But we need to develop a plan, I think, by the end of the year, and I think the 5 of us here can form the core of that, a series of activities, events leading up to September 2022 and beyond.
Yes.
Sava mentioned Hemingway, not writing about Smyrna, but not being there. But where Hemingway was Sonevro, was on the Evros River border, describing, and some of his poems and his writings talking about the way that the caravans of the Thracians were crossing the river into safety. These individuals are more than just testimonies. Their writings, their photographs, their stories are opportunities for us to make, and I keep hammering this point, to weave in to the fabric of the American social history, of American identity, the role of Americans, of Australians, of British, of New Zealanders, whoever, whichever country it is. Our goal should be in the next 12, 15 months to begin to make these stories an essential part of the national narratives of the countries. We've already started it, but we need to give it a really big push using the centenaries next year, particularly in the United States, being the centenary of the Archdiocese, the centenary of the biggest secular organization of Hellenes in the world, and the centenary of Smyrna. Opportunities for immense progress in developing and in promoting this, weaving, as I said, into the social fabric, into the consciousness of American and international society.
Thank you, Panayoti. Sava, some concluding remarks?
Yes, I just want to say that my co-author and I, in an effort to spread the word about the Greek genocide, we have donated books to approximately 30 universities that have genocide and Holocaust studies. So that was a small part, plus maybe hundreds of other books to individuals so far, to politicians in New York, in Washington rather, mainly, who are in support of our cause. The last thing is that I would say is I would like to congratulate you, the EMBCA, and you specifically, Ilya Aluf, for doing an event which encompasses not just Smyrna, but the entire genocide, because Smyrna was just the last phase. And if we start to cut it off, in pieces, like the Thrace, the genocide in Thrace, or the genocide in Pontus, or the genocide in Ionia, I think we are doing a disservice to ourselves.
Exactly.
It should be with one thing, and να μην το σαλαμοποιήσουμε που λέμε in Greek. In other words, slice it like salami.
Like
In other words, we should keep it as one thing. And another thing I want to say is we should move away from as possible, from the word catastrophe, because it could imply a natural catastrophe.
Natural disaster.
I think we should say destruction of Smyrna, because that conveys the fact that there was somebody who was responsible for that. Somebody who there is what do we call, what's the word? I can't think of the word anyway, but otherwise it was I'm sorry?
Perpetrator.
Perpetrator, exactly. So that there was a perpetrator in this thing. And not just in the case of Smyrna, but in the entire thing. So these are my concluding remarks, and thank you so much for.
No, thank you, and you're absolutely correct. And don't forget the word catastrophe. Smyrna catastrophe came from Hellas. Anyway, Peter, final.
Yes.
I know, but there's a lot of wrong. There are a lot of wrong things, so we have to correct them.
Exactly.
Okay.
Peter,
I'm going to emphasize the positive, if I may. And the positive is that I think we should take advantage of the momentum. What is the momentum? The momentum is that finally, after so many attempts of so many blood, sweat, and tears, the American government accepted, the president, the US president accepted that there was such a thing as an Armenian genocide. So that is very positive. And if you recall, the previous recognition of the Senate and the House of Representatives, okay, which happened 2 years ago, right, 2 or 3 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, in the preamble, besides the Armenians, it mentions all the other nationalities. So it's up to us now to take advantage of the momentum and to keep this issue alive. And that's where I also take my hat off to Lou Katsas, who is a true Greek epatrivis, if you know what the word means, epatrivis, okay? And who will support him? I've told him this since the first time I met him, in everything that he does, because the key thing to success is to keep something alive, to keep the hope alive. And that's the best way and the only way to be able to get a final ecumenical recognition for this particular issue. That's it.
thank you, Peter. As you know, both you, I, and Izmini must have done, I think, maybe in the last few years, maybe we've done 10 different scenarios related to the genocide.
Chiganos, like
No, but I'm going to conclude with what I'd like us to do after Izmini speaks. Izmini, some final words.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for giving me and everyone else the opportunity to speak truth to power, as it were, through social media, which is, as Panayiotis says, it's so important to promote what is happening. And I agree with so much that everyone said. And yes, Peter, we do need to seize the momentum, seize the moment. And as Panayiotis said, have activities, have events. And I would add, absolutely necessary in a concerted effort by everyone involved or has been affected or who has a heart for the terrible things that happened in that period. Not just Pontic Greeks or Asia Minor or Armenians, everyone, a concerted effort to promote the truth. And we need to promote the truth in order to counter the false Turkish narrative and propaganda, which continues unabated. It's just incredible. And lastly, I will say we not only have the momentum, not only we have the opportunities, but we have more resources now at our disposal, not only Zivi and Morris, which is meticulously done and in great depth, but another one I will bring up again is the, you can't see the Wolfram Gast book, which delved into the evidence from the German Foreign Office archives and provides damning information about what really happened, by whom. And again, this is from the German National Archives that are very valuable to us for our purposes of promoting the truth about genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Ismenia. There's a reason why I mentioned the 99th anniversary of the three organizations that we talked about, and also that we're coming into the 100th anniversary of both the HEPA, the Smyrna genocide, and of course the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. And the reason why I brought those up in terms of what's happening is what I'd like us to do is form, we have a small group here. There's other people, obviously, that would join us. And I would like to take it on a higher level with continuous seminars, discussions. It could be individually, whoever's here, having their own things, or collectively. But we do that starting with this particular panel discussion. We're starting, before the 100th anniversary of all these different organizations, because what's happening in my mind is this. We have also the 100th anniversary of the Turkish Republic coming in 2023. And I've always been concerned of what happens as we head towards that 100th anniversary. And what we have to do is double, triple, quadruple our discussions in terms of what created the formation of this particular republic. We have nothing, and I agree with you, Peter, we have nothing against Turks or anything of that nature. But the fact that this has not been recognized, the fact that we have not come, let's say, and have a moment, I don't want to say a Jesus moment, but we have a moment where we all discuss exactly what's happening and let the truth come out, with everyone trying, continually, for different purposes, political and otherwise, to hide the truth. So even though I cannot speak for AHEPA, because only the president of AHEPA can speak for AHEPA, but I'm the chairman of the Hellenic Cultural Commission, and I will bring it up to the president of AHEPA. What I'd like us to do, if we can, as AHEPA, because we are a national organization, and Peter also, obviously, we're into Australia, we're into Europe through AHEPA in Greece and all of Europe, by the way, and into Cyprus, etc., that we do a series of many events over the next year as we head to the 100th anniversary of both these organizations. Now, it becomes a little bit more complicated with the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, and in particular where the Patriarchate is under captivity. In other words, we have some serious issues here because of certain relationships, and the fact that the Patriarchate is obviously located in Constantinople. But regardless of that, and even if we can't get the full cooperation of various organizations, I think that we should absolutely, starting now, with this particular panel discussion, and we'll have a series of panel discussions, obviously, as we go along during the year with EMCA and other organizations, and AHEPA, obviously, that we take it nationally and internationally. So I would like some comments, from everyone, and I'd like to start with Panayoti in Australia. Can we get HEPA in Australia to link up to this particular concept over the next year?
HEPA in Australia, I cannot speak for, again, just like you, but I can speak for HEPA New South Wales, which is the biggest state. Yes, definitely. We will be so on board with that.
And if you can, because I'm also going to have a discussion with the president of AHEPA to see if we can take it nationally and internationally. If you can, speak to whoever you have to speak to see if you can do the same thing within Australia. And we do this as the diaspora again, because when we were talking about the revolution, without the diaspora, quite frankly, the revolution never would never taken place. So we might as well do another revolution in this particular case. Peter, your thoughts on what I just discussed?
Well, first of all, as you recall, you were not there when I spoke in Athens a few weeks ago about the role of AHEPA. I think AHEPA can play the biggest role in this.
Yes.
And thank you so much for being involved, man. As a matter of fact, I'd like to mention that in October, I believe, AHEPA, the biggest chapter of AHEPA in Manhattan, the Hermes, the Delphi chapter, is honoring you, correct?
That is correct. Thank you.
Okay.
You didn't
All
have to
right.
bring it up, but yeah.
No,
is-
no, listen, we have to give credit to our brothers and sisters, correct? So I think that I agree with you 100% that AHEPA can play the biggest role, because at the end of the day, with the research that I've done, statistics show that most of the ethnikotopica somatia organizations will cease to exist after a few years. So AHEPA is the key organization that can play a tremendous role in all of these issues that we're discussing. And that's my opinion.
Thank you, Peter. Sava, if we can help you in any way for you to be able to lecture or to go to different venues to speak about your book and the research that you've done, please talk to us and see how we can help in that regard, because I think that that's a tremendous thing that could happen. And for you to join in this, the more we do this, as we discussed, the more we do this, the more, regardless of what organization anyone is linked to, the more we have these discussions nationally and internationally, the better for this particular cause. Sava.
Yeah, I just want to say that we should be bringing the church also, not just AHEPA, but the church is such a strong organization. I mean, and covers the entire United States. That should be also in the forefront of this effort to, in other words, support this cause of recognizing the, and of course that that is a job in the way of the Archdiocese in New York, the Archbishop Elpidiaforos. So
can I say something, partner? I don't mean to interrupt you, but I should have mentioned it, that our position, especially in Athens, that there is two pillars in the Greek American community, AHEPA and the church. Right. And I personally have written articles on the subject, and I agree with you 100%, just to let you know that both, as a matter of fact, this year, Elias is also becoming an archon of the church, which shows the appreciation of the church for all the things that he has done. So I want to assure you that everything that we do in conjunction of the church, supporting the Archbishop Elpidiaforos and the ecumenical patriarch. I just wanted to say that. This way, we agree with you 100%.
Okay.
Thank you, Sava, and thank you, Peter. Ismini, we're waiting for your book, and of course, we encourage it to come out as quickly as possible. We do want to also support you in any way we can as it's coming along. You'll be part, if it's okay with you, of all these discussions, because we've had these discussions before. The panel, or maybe some of the listeners today may not realize it, but we were under tremendous pressure by Turkish organizations not to have some of the events that we had. And for those who don't know, Ismini, actually letters were written by various Turkish American organizations to the Board of Trustees of Georgetown, basically saying that she should be fired for having these type of discussions. And fortunately for her, she was supported by Georgetown, and congratulations to the university. Ismini.
Well, thank you. And thank you for bodyguards during that event. I felt a lot safer. That was very nice of you when that happened, when I finally came up to New York. But I must say that, yes, indeed, the academia must be involved. And we do events at Georgetown. So that's one way. Remember, we're in the Capitol, and we are very visible in international organizations, embassies, and so on, along with the government. But I think it's very important, again, I insist on that, to communicate the truth. And one way perhaps to think about it is that the truth is a recipe for personal, organizational, and national welfare. We really cannot be successful in anything we do unless we communicate the truth, however difficult it might be. So the truth must be known, and academia is a good place to start.
Thank you, Ismini, and thank you, panelists. To
And
the audience.
what about the book that Panagiotis, I think he said he's working on?
Well, listen, obviously, this extends to Panagiotis for sure. Okay. I didn't realize, quite frankly, that Panagiotis, until I read the article at academia.edu or whatever it was called, that he had written a piece on the orphans, on the
Children at war.
which if I knew, you would have been on another panel that I was going to have with regards to that. To the audience, thank you again for joining us today, and join us for EMCA's panel discussion later in the month. It's called Unfinished Business: Post-War Greek Adoption History and Current Adoptee Activism. It's a panel discussion that will be on Sunday, September 26th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and 9 p.m. Athens time. The distinguished panel will include Professor Gwanda Van Steen, the Korais Professor in the Center for Hellenic Studies and Department of Classics at King's College in London. Professor Mary Kardaras, Chair of the Department of Communication at California State University, East Bay, and lawyer Vasilis Sotiropoulos at the Supreme Court in the Hellenic Republic. The topic of Hellenic orphans, and many not so, brought over to America and other nations during the Cold War period of 1950s and 1960s, will be discussed in depth. This will include the history of post-war Hellenic adoptions, as well as the current activism activities around this very important area of concern, including the issue of restoring Hellenic citizenship to Hellenic adoptees. Join us all for these events. You can find out more information about them on embca.com on the internet. Those who wanted to know more about AHEPA, ahepa.org. And for those who want to just follow some of the panel discussions we're having that we post on YouTube, you can go to YouTube under EMBCA. Thank you all again. Thank you to the panelists for this very, 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 very interesting discussion, and one of the first of the next year's discussions on this very important topic that we're going to try to expand out, in particular as we come to the 100th anniversary of what we've been talking about, both for AHEPA and the final aspects or major aspects of the genocide, the Hellenic genocide. Thank you all again for attending today. Thank you all. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Luke.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you και καλημέρα from Sydney.
Thank you.
Kalimera.
Kalimera from,
Όπως
I'm on
όπως
Shelter
βλέπετε,
Island. Kalimera from Shelter Island. in
Thank
Long
you all.
όπως
Island.
βλέπετε ξημέρωσε.
Deborah, thank you all. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. This
Thank
was
you,
most
Sarah.
Thank you,
interesting.
Louis.
Thank you,
Bye.
Peter. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Καλημέρα.
Kalimera. Γεια σου.
Yes.